The woman who stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1879 was wearing another woman's name, and she wore it the way a person wears a coat 3 sizes too large, with her shoulders pulled in and her eyes cast low, hoping nobody would look closely enough to notice the poor fit. Her real name was Beatrice Conley. She had been born Beatrice Conley in a cramped boarding house in St. Louis 24 years ago, and she had carried that name through poverty and hunger, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching the world move forward without you. But the name she carried into Caldwell was written on the letter tucked inside her reticule, a letter addressed to one Mr. Harlan Webb, a cattle rancher with 40 acres south of town, a letter that promised him a wife by the name of Clara Hensley, age 26, formerly of Cincinnati, Ohio, a fine cook, and a woman of excellent moral character. Beatrice Conley was neither Clara Hensley nor a fine cook, and she was 24, not 26, but she was desperate in the way that only a woman with nowhere else to go could be desperate. And when Clara Hensley had gotten herself married to a banker in Memphis 3 days before she was supposed to board the stage west, she had sold her correspondence and her passage to Beatrice for $7 and a pair of leather gloves. $7 was a fortune to Beatrice at that moment. The gloves fit perfectly. She had taken both. Caldwell in 1879 was a cattle town on the edge of something enormous. The Kishom Trail ran through it like a spine, and in the spring the town swelled with drovers and cowboys pushing longhorns north, the streets turning to mud and noise and the particular sharp smell of cattle and unwashed men. It was not a gentle place, but it had something that St. Louis did not, which was the possibility of a future, and Beatrice Conley had come west to find one, even if she had to borrow someone else's name to do it. She stepped off the stage with one carpet bag and her borrowed name, and she stood in the street with the Kansas wind pulling at her dark hair, looking at the town around her, the saloon with its piano already playing at midday, the general store with barrels of flour outside the door, the land office with its faded painted sign, the smell of smoke and cattle, and something wild underneath it all that she could not name, but that made her lift her chin just slightly, as though she were breathing something she had been starved of. That was when Arthur Atkins saw her. He was leaning against the post outside the Caldwell Mercantile, not because he had anywhere pressing to be, but because it was a habit of his to stand still in the mornings and watch the stage come in. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered and lean from years of cattle work, with dark eyes the color of creek water after a rain and hands that were rough and brown from sun and rope. He wore a battered brown hat that had been through more weather than most men twice his age, and his boots were good boots, the kind a man saves for, the kind that last. He was not the kind of man who drew the eye immediately. He was the kind of man a woman noticed after a while, the way you notice something solid and reliable and true, not with a gasp, but with a slow settling feeling, like you have arrived somewhere safe. He watched her step off the stage and stand in the street with that lifted chin, and something in his chest did a thing it had not done in a long time. He pushed off the post and he did not go over to her, because he was not that kind of man either, the kind who pushed himself forward without invitation. He just watched. He noted the carpet bag, the good gloves, the way she looked around the town like she was reading it rather than just seeing it. He noted that she was beautiful in a way that was not immediately obvious, not the soft prettiness of a woman who had been protected all her life, but something sharper and more honest, like beauty that had been arrived at through weather. He went on about his business and told himself he had forgotten about her entirely. Beatrice found Harlan Webb's address through the land office, and she rode out to his property on the back of a wagon driven by a young man named Pete who delivered feed and did not ask questions, which she appreciated. The Webb Ranch was a modest operation, 40 acres of short grass prairie, a farmhouse that needed painting, a barn in better repair than the house, a vegetable garden that had gone somewhat ragged at the edges. There were 2 ranch hands she could see, working near the corral, and she straightened her spine as the wagon pulled up and told herself she was Clara Hensley, and that she had always been Clara Hensley, and that this was going to work. Harlan Webb came out of the house when he heard the wagon, and she knew immediately that he was not what she had hoped for. He was not unkind looking, but he was not warm either. He was a compact, weathered man of perhaps 45, with small eyes and a way of looking at her that was more assessment than welcome, the way a man looks at a horse he is considering purchasing. He looked her over from boot to hat, and she held herself still under that gaze and met his eyes and did not look away. "Clara Hensley," he said. It was not a question, and it was not warm. "Yes," she said, and the lie sat in her mouth like a stone. "You're younger than your letters suggested," he said. "The journey ages a person," she said, which was not entirely untrue. He showed her inside and showed her the kitchen and showed her the bedroom she would have until the wedding, which he proposed to schedule for 2 weeks hence, giving her time to settle and giving him time to, as he put it, ensure that the arrangement would be satisfactory. He said it in a way that made it clear the determining of satisfaction would be entirely his. She smiled and said that seemed very reasonable, and inside her chest something cold was beginning to form. She lay awake that first night in the narrow bed in the farmhouse bedroom and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had done. She had come 2,000 miles and lied her way into a stranger's house, and in 2 weeks she was supposed to marry a man who looked at her like an acquisition. She thought about Clara Hensley in Memphis, probably in a comfortable house now, her banker husband bringing her flowers. She thought about St. Louis and the boarding house and the factory work and the cold. She thought about that wind when she stepped off the stage, the way it had smelled like possibility. She was going to have to figure something out. The next morning she drove the small wagon into Caldwell to purchase the supplies that Harlan had listed for her, which was in itself a test. He wanted to see if she knew how to manage a household account, if she would be careful with money, if she would be sensible. She was in fact careful with money in the way that only people who have had very little of it ever learn to be, and she navigated the general store with quiet efficiency, checking prices and making substitutions where it made sense and arriving at the counter with a total that was $1.30 under what Harlan had given her. The man behind the counter at the Caldwell Mercantile was named Henderson, and he was perfectly pleasant, and when she turned with her wrapped parcels and nearly walked directly into Arthur Atkins, who was coming through the door, she did something she almost never did. She dropped everything. He caught 2 of the packages before they hit the floor. She caught one. They stood for a moment in the doorway of the mercantile, each holding a parcel, looking at each other, and she recognized him distantly as the man she had noticed leaning against the post the previous morning, the solid, quiet one, and he recognized her as the woman from the stage, the one with the lifted chin. "I apologize," he said. "That was my fault entirely. I came through the door without looking." "It was not your fault," she said. "I was not watching where I was going." They exchanged parcels in that awkward way of people who are handing things back and forth and cannot quite coordinate themselves, and she found herself trying not to smile because it was almost comical, this business of the packages, and when she finally had everything gathered and properly in the crook of her arm, she looked up and found him smiling too, not a large smile, but a real one. "Arthur Atkins," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Clara Hensley," she said, and the name sat in her mouth that same wrong way like a stone she could not swallow, and she watched something flicker in his dark eyes that she could not read, and then it was gone. "New to Caldwell?" he asked. "Yesterday," she said. "I came in on the stage." "I know," he said. "I saw you." He said it simply, without artifice, and she found that she did not know what to do with simple honesty after so much careful performance. So she adjusted her parcels and said she had better be getting on, and he stepped aside to let her through the door, and she walked to the wagon and did not look back, though she felt the weight of his gaze all the way across the street. Arthur stood in the doorway of the mercantile for a moment after she left, and Henderson said from behind the counter, That is Harlan Webb's intended, come out from Cincinnati. Arthur bought his flour and his coffee and went back to the Dawson Ranch where he worked, and he thought about the way she had said her own name, because whatever name she had given, it had not sounded like hers. He had a knack for that, for the sound of truth versus the sound of something careful. His mother had called it his gift and his trouble in equal measure. The next 2 weeks moved like a river with two currents, one on the surface, calm and purposeful, and one underneath, pulling in a direction nobody had planned for. On the surface, Beatrice drove the wagon to town every few days for supplies, and she cooked and cleaned at the Webb Ranch and tried to imagine herself marrying Harlan Webb and building a life inside those 40 acres, and she could not make herself fully imagine it. Not because the work frightened her. She had worked hard her whole life and was not afraid of it, but because Harlan Webb looked at her and saw a function rather than a person. He barely asked her a question that was not about the house. He did not ask where she was from or what she liked or what she had dreamed about. He asked if she could make biscuits, and when she said yes, he said good. Underneath, every time she came into Caldwell, she saw Arthur Atkins. Not always immediately, and not always in ways that could be called planned, but Caldwell was not a large town, and a man who worked a ranch south of town and came in for supplies and mail on his days off was going to encounter a woman who came in for supplies and mail on the days when she could persuade Harlan to let her take the wagon. They encountered each other outside the post office and at the feed store, and once at the edge of town where the road crossed the creek, where she had stopped the wagon because one of the horses had thrown a shoe and she did not know what to do about it, and he came along the road on his own horse and dismounted without being asked and looked at the horse's hoof and said there was a farrier 2 streets over and he would walk the horse there with her if she did not mind the company. She did not mind the company. They walked together through Caldwell in the mid-morning light with the lame horse between them, and she found that talking to him was different from talking to anyone else she could remember. He did not perform himself. He did not say things to impress her or to manage her perception of him. He said things because they were true and because he thought she might find them interesting, and he asked things because he genuinely wanted to know. He asked about the journey west, and she told him about the stage route and the red dust in Oklahoma Territory, and the way the land changed as you got further west, how it opened up and became enormous, and he listened with the full attention of a man who loves a place and loves hearing it described by someone seeing it fresh. She asked about him, and he told her he had come to Caldwell 4 years ago from Missouri, that he had worked cattle all his adult life, that he had a room at the Dawson Ranch and a good horse named Cassidy, and enough money saved that he was beginning to think seriously about land of his own, a small spread, nothing fancy, something he could work himself with maybe one good hand to help. "You want your own ranch," she said. "I want a home," he said, with the careful distinction of a man who has thought about the difference for a long time. She looked at him sideways as they walked, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the sense that she was in the presence of someone who was genuinely good. Not performing goodness, not goodness as social currency, but the real quiet thing. The farrier fixed the shoe. Arthur helped her settle the horse back in the traces. He held her hand briefly to help her up onto the wagon seat, and the contact lasted only a second, but she was aware of it with a sharpness that told her she was in trouble. "Thank you," she said. "It was nothing at all," he said. He touched the brim of his hat and she drove away, and the whole ride back to the Webb Ranch she told herself that she was Clara Hensley, and in 10 days she was going to marry Harlan Webb, and none of this, the walks, the easy conversation, the warmth in her chest like a fire that someone had just added good wood to, none of this was something she was allowed to feel. On the 8th day before the scheduled wedding, Beatrice discovered something that changed the shape of everything. She was cleaning the sitting room at the Webb farmhouse, and she moved a stack of papers on the side table to dust underneath them, and in the stack was a letter, and she would not have read it except that it was face up, and the first line caught her eye because it contained her borrowed name. The letter was from a man in Cincinnati named Thomas Hensley, and it was addressed to Harlan Webb, and it said, in plain and civil language, that the man's sister Clara had not in fact been widowed as she had represented in her correspondence, that Clara Hensley had in fact been briefly married to a man in Memphis named Gerald Patterson, and that the marriage was currently the subject of a legal inquiry, and that the writer felt it his duty to inform Mr. Webb of these circumstances before any arrangements were made permanent. Beatrice stood very still in the sitting room with the duster in her hand and read the letter twice. So Clara Hensley had not only sold her name, she had sold a name that was, depending on one's interpretation, already attached to someone else. The practical consequence of this was that if Beatrice went through with the wedding as Clara Hensley, she would be marrying Harlan Webb under a fraudulent name and with fraudulent personal circumstances, which was not simply morally complicated but potentially criminal. And that was before the question of what happened when Harlan Webb received this letter. He must not have read it yet, or he had read it and was waiting, watching her, deciding what to do. She set the letter back where she had found it. She finished dusting the room. She went to the kitchen and made supper with careful hands and a racing mind, and that evening at the table Harlan Webb looked at her across the beans and cornbread with those small assessing eyes and said, "Clara, how are you finding the arrangements here?" "Satisfactory. Very satisfactory," she said, and she heard the lie in her own voice and wondered if he heard it too. That night she lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and made a decision. Not a comfortable decision or a safe one, but the only honest one she could arrive at. She could not marry Harlan Webb as Clara Hensley. She could not. Not because of the legal complexity, though that was real, but because Beatrice Conley had spent 24 years being smaller than she was and making herself fit into spaces that were not made for her, and she was not going to spend the rest of her life as a woman whose very name was borrowed and wrong. The question was what she was going to do instead. She had $7 saved from the money Harlan had given her for the household, small amounts she had been careful with. She had her carpet bag. She had her own name, for whatever that was worth. She did not have, as she lay there in the dark doing the careful accounting of her situation, any plan whatsoever. In the morning she drove the wagon into Caldwell on the pretext of needing thread, and she was not looking for Arthur Atkins, she told herself. She was simply going into town, but she found him at the post office when she came out of the dry goods store, and this time she did not simply nod and move on. This time she stood on the boardwalk in the May morning with the sun on the false-fronted buildings and the sound of the cattle pens from the south end of town, and she said, "Mr. Atkins, I wonder if I might speak plainly with you." He looked at her with those creekwater eyes and said, "I think I would like that very much." They sat on the bench outside the land office and she told him most of it. Not all of it immediately. She started with the letter, with what she had found, with the legal situation she was in. She watched him listen and she watched him not react with alarm or judgment, just listening, turning it over in his mind. Then she told him the rest. She told him her name was not Clara Hensley. She told him her name was Beatrice Conley and she was from St. Louis and she had come west with a borrowed name because she had been desperate, and a woman in her situation did not have many options, and she was not proud of it but she was not ashamed of it either, and she needed him to know the truth because she could not keep speaking to him as someone she was not. When she finished, there was a pause, and a wagon went past in the street, and somewhere a dog barked, and the wind came through and lifted a curl of dark hair against her cheek. "Beatrice Conley," he said, the way a person says a thing they are testing the weight of. "Yes," she said. "That's a good name," he said. She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "I cannot stay at the Webb Ranch. I cannot marry him under a name that is not mine, but I have almost nothing and I do not know the town and she stopped herself. She had not planned to say any of that. She had not planned to sit here and enumerate her vulnerabilities to a man she had known for less than 2 weeks. "You could work," he said. "There's a woman here in Caldwell, a Mrs. Eleanor Graves, who runs the hotel boarding house on the main street. She is always needing help with rooms and the kitchen. She is a fair woman. I think she would speak with you." "Would she take me on the word of someone she does not know?" "She would take you on my word," he said, with a simple confidence that was not arrogance. "I have done some work for her husband's estate these past years since he passed. She trusts me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you helping me?" He looked back at her with those honest eyes and said, "Because you told me the truth, and because your situation is not your fault, not entirely, and because—" He stopped. He looked out at the street. "Because I would like to keep talking to you, and if you have to leave Caldwell or go through with something that is wrong, then I cannot do that. So it is partly selfish," he said, with a slight upward curve at the corner of his mouth. She felt the fire in her chest again. She looked away from him before it showed on her face. She drove back to the Webb ranch that afternoon and she told Harlan Webb that she could not go through with the wedding. She did not tell him why in full. She told him only that she had realized she was not the woman he needed and that she was sorry for the disruption and that she would be leaving in the morning. He was angry, and his anger was cold and controlled, which was in some ways worse than shouting. He said she had wasted his time and put him to expense, and that she was not what had been represented, which was more accurate than he knew. She stood in the kitchen of his farmhouse and took his cold anger without flinching, and in the morning she packed her carpet bag and she left. She walked into Caldwell with her bag in her hand and her real name on her tongue, and she went to the boarding house hotel on the main street, and she asked for Mrs. Eleanor Graves. Mrs. Graves was a tall woman of about 55, spare and precise, with sharp blue eyes that did not miss much and a way of speaking that was direct and not unkind. She listened to Beatrice's story, the abbreviated and truthful version, leaving out the false name, saying only that the arrangement with the rancher had not worked out and that she was looking for work and a place to stay and that Arthur Atkins had thought Mrs. Graves might speak with her. Mrs. Graves looked at her for a moment with those blue eyes. "Arthur Atkins sent you," she said. "He suggested it," Beatrice said carefully. "Can you cook?" "I can. I am not fancy, but I am reliable." "Can you make bread?" "Yes." "Can you keep a room clean enough that a paying guest does not complain?" "Yes." $3 a week and you take your meals here," Mrs. Graves said. "You will have the small room at the back. You will start tomorrow morning." Beatrice said yes so quickly that Mrs. Graves almost smiled. She went to find Arthur Atkins that afternoon to tell him it had worked. She found him at the livery stable where he was tending to Cassidy, the good horse, with a brush and the focused attention of a man who takes his relationships seriously, even when those relationships are with animals. He looked up when she came through the stable door, and the way his face changed, just slightly, just a warming, was something she was beginning to recognize as one of the small private vocabularies of his expression. "She took you on," he said. "She took me on," Beatrice said. "Thank you, Arthur." He said her name aloud for the second time, this time her real name, and the sound of it in his voice, just those 3 syllables, that particular combination, did something to her equilibrium that she had to work to conceal. That was the beginning of something that neither of them could have mapped or planned, but that was as inevitable as the river finding the sea. She settled into the boarding house and into Caldwell with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who has had to make herself at home in many difficult places. She learned the town's rhythms. The weeks when the cattle drives brought the drovers through and the boarding house filled up and she barely slept, and the quieter weeks between drives when the town breathed out and she could walk to the creek in the evenings and sit in the tall grass and watch the sunset set the prairie on fire. She made good bread and kept clean rooms and became quietly indispensable to Mrs. Graves, who was not free with compliments but who showed her approval in the form of an extra lamp for her room and the occasional piece of pie left on her doorstep. She told Mrs. Graves her real name. She told her everything, in fact, One evening in the kitchen when it was late and they were sitting together with cups of coffee, and Mrs. Graves listened to the whole of it and then said, "I thought you were not from Cincinnati. You do not have the way of speaking." "I am from St. Louis," Beatrice said. "That explains it," Mrs. Graves said, as though St. Louis explained not just the accent but the whole complicated trajectory of Beatrice's life. Then she said that was a brave thing to leave the ranch and come here with nothing. "It was not brave," Beatrice said. "I was terrified." "Child," Mrs. Graves said, "those are the same thing." Arthur came by the boarding house on his off days, which were Wednesdays and Sundays when the Dawson Ranch did not need him. He came in the way of a man who has a legitimate reason to be there. He had business with Mrs. Graves sometimes, a fence post to mend, a piece of heavy furniture to move, a leaky section of roof to examine, but he also came because Beatrice was there, and they both knew it, and Mrs. Graves knew it too and said nothing, because she was a sensible woman who had been in love herself once and recognized the symptoms. They would sit on the front porch of the boarding house in the evenings when the work was done, or walk down to the creek when the weather was good, and they talked. They talked the way people talk when they have found someone whose mind fits companionably against their own, not always about important things, not always about the large shapings of life and feeling, but also about those things. He told her about Missouri and his family, his father who had been a farmer and his mother who had been a reader, who had given him the habit of looking carefully at things. He told her about the cattle drives he had ridden in the early years, the trail running north with hundreds of longhorns, and the particular solitude of night watch, sitting on a horse in the dark with the stars enormous above the flat grass and nothing between you and the sky. He told her it was beautiful in a way that was hard to explain, that kind of solitude, beautiful and lonely in equal measure. She told him about St. Louis, about growing up in the boarding house where her mother had worked, about learning to read from the books that the other tenants left behind. She told him about the factory where she had worked for 3 years, the noise and the repetition, and the feeling that the future was a room with no door. She told him about Clara Hensley and the $7 and the leather gloves and the way she had felt standing in the street in Caldwell that first morning with the wind and the smell of something that was not St. Louis. "What did it smell like?" he asked. "Like possibility," she said. "I know that sounds foolish." "No," he said. "I know exactly what you mean. This place has that. Not everyone can smell it, but when you can, it gets into you." They were sitting on the bank of the creek when she said that, in the long June light, with the cottonwoods making their sound in the wind, and he was close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the way his hands rested on his knees, those capable, honest hands, and she thought, "I am in love with this man." She thought it quietly and completely, without surprise, the way you acknowledge a thing that has been true for some time and that you have simply been waiting to name. She did not say it. She had been honest with him about almost everything, but she was not sure she was brave enough to be honest about that. He was having a parallel experience that he was managing with similar caution. He was a man who had been alone for a long time, not unhappily, but alone, and he had stopped expecting the kind of company he now found himself in, the kind that made everything, the prairie, the sky, the ordinary Tuesday morning feel larger and more real. He was aware that she was employed and settling and finding her footing, and that it was not the right time to complicate things with what he felt, which was considerable and daily increasing, a kind of steadfast affection that had its roots in respect and its flowers in everything else. The situation with Harlan Webb resolved itself in July, not violently, which was a relief, but not without difficulty. Harlan came into town and made it known that he had been deceived and he was not wrong, and for a while there was social discomfort, the particular small-town suffocation of gossip. Mrs. Graves handled it with the authority of a woman who has been in Caldwell long enough to have opinions that carry weight, and she said publicly and plainly that Beatrice was her employee and a hard worker and a woman of good character, and that anyone who wanted to suggest otherwise was welcome to bring their laundry elsewhere. This had the effect of cooling most of the talk considerably. Arthur handled his part of it differently. He did not make speeches. He simply continued to be seen with Beatrice in the ordinary ways of a man who has no apologies to make, walking to the post office together, sitting on the boarding house porch, sharing a table at the diner on Sunday afternoons. And the town, which respected Arthur Atkins as a steady and honest man, took note of this and adjusted its view accordingly. Harlan Webb left for Wichita in August on business and did not return, and his property was eventually sold through an agent, and that was the end of that chapter. In September, on a Wednesday afternoon when the light was golden and the air had the first edge of autumn in it, Arthur took Beatrice to see the land he had been thinking about purchasing. It was a parcel of 80 acres about 4 miles outside Caldwell to the northwest, with a good creek running through the southern end and a small stand of cottonwood trees and an old dugout on the rise that had been someone's first attempt at a house and had since been abandoned. He had arranged to see it through the land office, and he had asked her casually if she would like to come along because he valued her eye for things. She walked the land with him in the autumn light, and she could feel what it wanted to be. She could feel the house that ought to stand on the rise where the old dugout was, with windows that caught the morning light, and the garden that could go on the south side, and the way the creek would sound in the summer. She walked and she looked, and she asked questions about soil and water rights and the practicalities, and he watched her walk his potential land, and something settled so completely in his chest that it was almost painful. She stopped at the edge of the cottonwood stand and turned back toward him and said, "You should buy it." "I intend to," he said. "It is a good piece of land," she said. "It could be something real." "I think so too," he said. Then he said, "Beatrice." Something in the way he said her name, the weight in it, the deliberateness made her go very still. "I have been trying to find the right time to say something to you," he said. "And I have come to the conclusion that there is not a right time. There is only the time when you say it or the time when you do not, and I do not want to be the kind of man who does not." She looked at him across the short autumn grass, and the cottonwood leaves were going gold above them, and the light was everything. "I love you," he said. It was simple and plain and completely true. "I have been in the presence of a great many people in my life, and I have never felt as much like myself as I do when I am with you. And I know that your situation is complicated, and I know that you have only just arrived at something solid and you may not want anything to disturb that. But I needed you to know." She crossed the distance between them without thinking about it, without planning it, just the way a river moves toward the sea, which is to say inevitably, and she put her hand against the side of his face, the rough, warm skin of his jaw, and she looked at him very directly and said, "I fell in love with you while you were brushing your horse at the livery stable in May, and I have been waiting for you to say something ever since." He made a sound that was half laugh and half something much more serious, and then his arms came around her in the slow and deliberate way of a man who intends to do something well, and he held her in the October light on the land that was about to be his, and she felt the solidity of him, the realness, and she thought, "This is what I came west for." Not this man specifically, because she could not have known him, but this quality of being fully and truly arrived somewhere, the possibility she had smelled in the wind that first morning. He kissed her then, and it was the kind of kiss that a person remembers not for drama but for honesty, gentle and certain and entirely itself. He bought the land in October for $340, which took nearly all his savings but left him the land and the creek and the cottonwoods and a plan. He spent October and November working with 2 men he hired, one a Caldwell man named Doyle who was good with timber framing, and one a younger man named Sam who was quiet and steady and knew about foundations, and he built a house on the rise where the old dugout had been. Not a grand house, but a proper one, with a real floor and real windows, and a kitchen with a good stove, and a porch that faced east to catch the morning. Beatrice came out to the property on Sundays, and she watched it take shape, and sometimes she brought lunch and they sat in the incomplete house with the walls around them, and ate and talked, and occasionally she picked up a hammer and did something useful, and he watched her with a mixture of love and amusement that he did not entirely conceal. Mrs. Graves watched all of this unfold with the satisfaction of a woman who has seen enough of life to recognize something good when it is happening, and she began to quietly think about who would do the kitchen work when Beatrice left, because that was clearly the direction things were going. In December, 3 weeks before Christmas, Arthur Atkins took Beatrice Conley to the spot by the creek where the cottonwoods grew in the early evening when the first stars were appearing, and he asked her to marry him. He did not have a ring yet, he was working on that, but he had the words, and he had the land and the house and himself, which he offered with a completeness that she recognized. She said yes. She said it immediately, without equivocation, and then she laughed because he had clearly been nervous, and the relief on his face was so transparently complete that it was one of the most wonderful things she had ever seen on another person. He got the ring the following week. He had it made by a silversmith who came through Caldwell on his circuit every few months, a man named Pacheco who worked in silver and turquoise, and whose work was beautiful. The ring was a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone the color of the Kansas sky in summer, and when Arthur put it on her finger in the kitchen of the boarding house, while Mrs. Graves watched from the doorway with her arms folded, and an expression of great satisfaction, Beatrice Conley looked at it on her hand and thought that she had never owned anything so purely beautiful in her whole life, and that it had been given to her under her real name, which was maybe the most beautiful thing about it. They were married on a Saturday in late January of 1880 in the church on the north side of Caldwell, with Mrs. Graves as witness on Beatrice's side and a rancher named Joseph Dawson, Arthur's employer and friend, as witness on his. The preacher was a man named Holloway who had a strong voice and a kind manner, and the ceremony was brief and warm and specific, not general, because Arthur had asked the preacher to say things that were true rather than just traditional, and Holloway had obliged. The church was not full, but it was not empty either. Mrs. Graves had told a number of people, and some of the townspeople had come because they liked Arthur and had come to like Beatrice, and because a wedding in winter in a cattle town is a particular kind of warmth that people come to stand near. When the preacher said the words, when he said Arthur's name and Beatrice's name together, when he said husband and wife, Arthur reached out and took her hand without waiting to be instructed to, and she held his hand, and she was Beatrice Atkins in that moment, wearing his name, which fit her entirely differently from the name she had arrived in. She had arrived wearing the wrong name, a name that pinched and gaped and sat wrong on her. She left the church wearing his name, and it fit the way a thing fits when it has been made for you. They drove out to the house in the northwest that afternoon, through the cold January light, with the prairie silver and still around them and their breath making clouds in the air. He carried her over the threshold of the house he had built. She protested that this was unnecessary, and he did it anyway, and she was laughing when he set her down inside, and the house smelled of new wood and the pie that Mrs. Graves had made them and left on the table with a note that said simply, "Be happy." They were happy. Not in the smooth, frictionless way of a fairy story, because that kind of happiness is not real and would not have fit either of them anyway, but in the deep and textured way of two people who have chosen each other with full knowledge and full intention. They worked the land together through that first spring, Arthur with the cattle he had purchased, and the fencing and the constant maintenance of an 80-acre operation, and Beatrice with the garden she put in on the south side of the house, just where she had imagined it, and with the kitchen and the household accounts, and the eggs from the 6 hens she installed, in a coop that Arthur built her in a single Saturday afternoon. There was still the question of what the land could become. He had 80 acres, but he was thinking about more, about whether cattle was the right approach or whether horses might be better on this particular stretch of ground. They talked about it in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table or on the porch when the weather was good, going over the numbers and the options with the seriousness of two people who understand that they are building something that is supposed to last. They disagreed sometimes, not about large things, but about the smaller practical decisions, and these disagreements had a quality that Beatrice had never experienced before. They were conducted as conversations between equals, as negotiations between two people who respect each other's intelligence, and they resolved into decisions that were genuinely better for the having of two minds on them. She had never been in a partnership like this. She had not known it was possible. In April of 1880, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and she was braced for whatever he might feel, because even a man who loved you could feel complicated things about this, about the timing, about the change. He looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her face in his rough hands and looked at her with those dark eyes, and what she saw in them was uncomplicated. "A child," he said, as though he were turning it over and marveling at the weight of it. "Sometime in October, I think," she said. "A child," he said again. "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it," he said. He was more careful with her after that, not smothering, not the kind of care that reduces a capable woman to a fragile object, but the kind of attentiveness that says, "You are important to me. What you are carrying is important. I am here." He did the heavier work himself without making a production of it. He made sure she rested. He drove her into Caldwell to see the doctor, a man named Calvert who had been in town for 2 years and was a competent and practical physician, and he sat in the waiting room with his hat in his hands while she was examined, and he was there when she came out. The summer of 1880 was a good summer on the Atkins land. The cattle were healthy and the garden was extraordinary. Beatrice had a talent for growing things that she had not known she possessed, and the kitchen was full of preserved vegetables and dried herbs and the smell of good cooking. She wrote a long letter to her mother in St. Louis, the first real letter she had written in years, telling her mother where she was and who she had become and asking her to come west if she could manage it, because the prairie needed more of her mother's practicality and the house had a room that was waiting. Her mother wrote back in August. She said she would come in the spring. She said Beatrice sounded happier than she had ever heard her. She said she was looking forward to meeting Arthur, about whom she had read 3 times in the letter. In October of 1880, Beatrice Atkins gave birth to a boy. He arrived in the evening of an October day much like the one when his parents had stood in the cottonwood stand, and said the things that needed saying, and the light was the same gold and the air had the same edge of autumn in it, which Arthur would later say was not a coincidence, but which Beatrice said was the kind of thing only a man would call meaningful, and not a coincidence. The boy was named Thomas, for no particular grand reason except that it was a good name and it sat right, and he was healthy and loud, and had Arthur's dark eyes and Beatrice's way of lifting his chin when he was displeased. Arthur held him in the kitchen that first night while Beatrice rested, and Mrs. Graves, who had driven out from town when the news reached her, sat by the fire and watched Arthur Atkins hold his son with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know that this particular scene is worth more than most of what the world offers. "You are going to be a good father, Mrs. Graves told him, not as a prediction but as an observation of something already visible. "I am going to try to be," he said, with the specific humility of a man who takes the responsibility seriously. Thomas grew the way healthy children grow on prairie air and good food, and the particular combination of warmth and structure that 2 intelligent adults who love each other create without effort. He was a lively boy, curious and stubborn and quick to laugh, and the house on the rise above the creek became the kind of house that has sound in it, boots on the porch and the boys' questions, and the sound of cooking and the ongoing conversation between 2 people who have not yet run out of things to say to each other. In the spring of 1881, Beatrice's mother arrived. Her name was Margaret Conley, and she was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 52 who had seen a great deal and forgotten none of it. And she stepped off the stage in Caldwell and stood in the street in much the same way her daughter had stood 2 years before, looking around at the town with that reading gaze rather than just seeing. Arthur was there to meet her with the wagon, and she looked at him for a long moment before she looked at the wagon or the town, and then she said, "You are Arthur." "I am," he said. "Good," she said, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. And that was the beginning of a relationship between Arthur Atkins and his mother-in-law that was founded on mutual respect and sustained by a shared understanding of what Beatrice was worth. Margaret stayed. She did not announce that she was staying permanently. She was far too practical for grand announcements. But as the weeks became a month and then 2 months, it became clear that she had found in the Atkins house and the Kansas prairie what her daughter had found: the smell of possibility, and in her case, the smell of being needed and of being close to a grandchild who regarded her with the specific adoration that very small children reserve for grandparents who are willing to tell long stories. She had her own room and her own routines, and she was useful in the way that capable people are always useful when they apply themselves, and the house expanded to hold her without difficulty. By 1882, the Atkins spread had grown to 120 acres. Arthur had purchased the adjacent 40 acres from a homesteader who had decided that Kansas was not for him, and the additional land gave him room for more cattle and for the horses he was increasingly interested in. He had begun breeding a small line of working horses, not for racing or show, but for the practical daily work of a cattle operation. And he had a gift for it, the same gift he had for recognizing the truth in things, applied now to the soundness of a horse's leg and the quality of its temperament. Beatrice expanded the garden to supply not just the household, but a small surplus that she sold at the town market on Saturday mornings. This had not been the plan. There had not been a plan exactly, just abundance in the garden and the practical Conley response to abundance, which was to find a use for it. But it became a real and regular income stream over time, and she managed it with the same careful eye for numbers that had impressed Harlan Webb's household accounts and Mrs. Graves's books, and she felt in it a particular satisfaction, the satisfaction of having made something from the ground up. In the winter of 1882, she told Arthur she was expecting again, and this time he did not repeat the word twice, though she would have been glad if he had. He smiled, a wide and genuine smile, the kind he rarely showed publicly, but that she had come to know as one of the best things about him. And he said they would need to extend the back of the house, that he had been thinking about it anyway. And she laughed because only Arthur Atkins would respond to the news of a second child with the immediate and practical consideration of square footage. They extended the back of the house in the spring, and the second child arrived in June of 1883, a girl this time, which Thomas received with the complex combination of excitement and suspicion that a 2-year-old boy brings to the arrival of a sibling, and which Margaret received with a barely concealed delight. They named her Rose because it was June and the wild prairie roses were blooming along the creek, and because Beatrice had loved roses her whole life and had never before been in a position to give that love form. Mrs. Graves drove out to see the baby, and she held Rose in her precise and careful arms and said that she was a fine baby and a fine name, and that she hoped the next one would be a boy again, because the name Thomas needed company, which was her way of saying she was very happy for them. The town of Caldwell continued to change around them in the way that cattle towns changed in the early 1880s, sometimes growing, sometimes contracting with the changing routes of the trail drives, occasionally violent with the particular violence of a place that has too many armed young men passing through. Beatrice and Arthur watched these changes from the vantage point of people who have planted themselves deliberately and are not at the mercy of every wind. They were part of the town but not entirely subject to it. They had the land and the house and the creek and the cottonwoods that had gone gold every autumn, now 3 autumns since the ring. In 1883, the cattle trade through Caldwell shifted, as it shifted through every Kansas cattle town eventually, as the railroads reached further south and the trail drives found new routes or ended. This was a concern for some of the ranchers who depended entirely on the drovers' trade, but Arthur had seen it coming and had planned for it, and the horse breeding operation was by now producing solid working horses that sold well to ranchers across a 100-mile radius. He had also expanded the cattle herd with an eye toward supply to the eastern beef markets rather than the seasonal drovers' economy, which meant more stability even as the town around them navigated change. The injustices of the era were not invisible to them. The Kishom Trail passed through land that had once been something entirely different, and the men who drove the cattle north sometimes told stories of the territories south of Kansas that were not comfortable stories. Arthur had worked with Indian cowboys on trail drives in his early years, men from the 5 civilized tribes who were skilled horsemen and vaqueros, and he had seen the dissonance between the reality of those men's lives and the way the world was arranged around them. He did not pretend this dissonance away. He talked about it with Beatrice, who had grown up in St. Louis, where the injustices of the aftermath of the war were daily visible if you were willing to look, and they agreed that they could not undo what was enormous and historical, but they could conduct their own affairs with fairness, which they did, in the hiring of hands and the dealing with neighbors and the ordinary daily practice of treating people as people. One of their ranch hands from 1883 onward was a man named James Crow, part Cherokee and part Creek, who was one of the finest horsemen Arthur had ever worked with, and who became in time a genuine friend, eating at their kitchen table on winter evenings and teaching Thomas, who idolized him, things about horses that Arthur could not have taught because they came from a knowledge older than Arthur's experience. Beatrice treated James Crow with the same uncomplicated respect with which she treated everyone who worked with them, and he noted this, as people note when they are treated as equals by those who could choose otherwise, and the friendship that developed between him and the Atkins family was one of the good things that grew from those years, solid and lasting. The 4th year in the house on the rise, Beatrice was sitting on the porch one evening in the long summer light, watching Arthur and Thomas in the corral below. Thomas was 4 now, and Arthur was teaching him to be around the horses, to move calmly, and to read the animal's mood, and she felt something so complete that it stopped her breath for a moment. She had arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1879, wearing someone else's name, terrified and determined and running toward something she could not name. She was sitting now on a porch that her husband had built, on land that was theirs together, with a baby girl asleep inside and a grandmother in the kitchen, and a boy in the corral learning to stand still near something large and powerful. And the name on the letters that came to this house was her own name, her real name, Beatrice Atkins. Arthur looked up from the corral and saw her on the porch, and something in the way he looked at her across the distance, just for a moment, the way a man looks at the specific thing in the world that makes the world make sense, made her press her hand briefly against her chest. She got up and walked down to the corral fence, and she leaned on it, and he came over to where she was, and they stood side by side with Thomas in the background making friends with a young bay horse that had the patience for small visitors. "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he could tell she was in the middle of something. "I am thinking about names," she said. He was quiet for a moment, understanding her, because he was a man who had come to understand her with the depth that only time and attention produces. "Which names?" "The wrong one I came in with," she said, "and the right one I have now." He looked out at the corral where Thomas was now very gravely patting the bay horse's nose. "You would have found your way regardless," he said. "The name was just the means." "Maybe," she said, "but I am glad it was this way. I am glad it was this. She meant the land and the house and him and Thomas and Rose and her mother's voice in the kitchen, the whole of it. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, into the solid and familiar warmth of him, the man who had looked up from the post outside the Mercantile and seen her standing in the street with the wrong name and said nothing at the time but had seen her nonetheless. "I am also glad," he said. "Considerable glad is what I am." She laughed because that was one of his phrases, considerable, applied to things that did not usually take degrees of measurement, and she had come to love it. Thomas called from the middle of the corral with the urgency of a 4-year-old who has made a significant discovery, and they both looked up, and the bay horse had apparently allowed Thomas to put both arms around its nose in a kind of hug, and Thomas was looking at them with an expression of triumph, so complete it was almost too large for his face. "Considerable glad," she said. "In the autumn of 1884, Mrs. Graves sold the boarding house and retired to a small house on the east side of Caldwell that she had purchased with impressive financial discipline over the years of running her business. She sold the boarding house to a couple from Topeka, and she made her peace with the new chapter. And on the day she moved into her small house, Arthur and Beatrice drove into town with Thomas and Rose in the wagon, and they helped her move the furniture. And in the evening they sat together in her new sitting room, and Mrs. Graves said that she was content, which coming from her was the highest possible praise for a situation. She became a regular visitor at the Atkins house in the years that followed. She and Margaret Conley, who had once been strangers, developed a friendship founded on the fact that they were both practical, intelligent women of a certain age who had built their own lives with their own hands, and had strong opinions about biscuits and the correct way to manage accounts. They argued about biscuits pleasurably and agreed about accounts, and the friendship suited both of them perfectly. In 1885, Arthur hired a second hand in addition to James Crow, a young man of 20 named Daniel Porter, from a family in Wichita, who had the energy and the eagerness of a young man who is determined to be useful and the good sense to learn from people who know more than he does. Arthur found that he had a talent for teaching that he had not known about before he had someone to teach, and Daniel Porter learned the horse operation with a speed that was gratifying, and within 2 years he was running portions of it independently, which freed Arthur to think about the next thing. The next thing, by 1886, was a decision. Kansas was changing. The cattle era that had defined Caldwell was transforming into something more settled, more agricultural, more ordinary in the way that frontiers always eventually become ordinary, which is to say they become home. Arthur and Beatrice talked about whether this was the kind of change they wanted to stay inside, whether the 120 acres and the horses and the cattle were the shape of the future, or whether the future had a different shape. It did not have a different shape. That was the conclusion they arrived at together, over several evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the children asleep in the back rooms, and the sound of the prairie through the open window. This was the shape. This land, this house, these horses. This was the home that he had said he wanted that first morning when she had asked about him. Not a ranch in the way of a grand operation, but a home in the way of something real and lasting. They decided to stay. They decided it with the quiet certainty of people who are not fleeing anything and not chasing anything, who have found the thing and know it for what it is. By 1880, Thomas was 6 and attending the school that had been established in Caldwell 3 years prior, walking into town on school days with a seriousness of purpose that made both his parents smile behind his back. He had Arthur's steadiness and Beatrice's quickness, and he was forming already into a person of some character, which was visible in small things. The way he stood up for a younger child who was being bullied behind the school, the way he asked questions that went past the surface, the way he watched things before engaging with them. Rose was 4 and nothing like Thomas in temperament. Where he was steady and deliberate, she was quick and loud, and full of a physical confidence that kept Beatrice in a state of ongoing mild alarm, because Rose climbed things and ran toward things, and generally approached the world with the assumption that it would accommodate her. She was not wrong often enough to discourage this assumption, which meant Beatrice spent considerable energy hoping the world would continue to cooperate. Beatrice was expecting their third child in the winter of 1887. She told Arthur in the kitchen one morning in late September, and he received the news with the quiet joy that was now his established way of receiving such news. He never shouted or made a large gesture, but the quality of his stillness changed, became warm and full like a room when the fire catches. 3 children, he said. 3 children, she confirmed. We will need to extend the house again, he said. Arthur, she said. The back corner, he said. I have been looking at it. Of course you have, she said, and she went around the table and kissed him on the cheek, and he caught her hand and held it. The third child arrived in February of 1888, another boy, named William, who came into the world with a calm that surprised the doctor and an immediately apparent disposition toward observation. He was the kind of baby who looked at things with a focused attention that seemed too old for his face. Beatrice said he reminded her of Arthur, which was both an observation and a compliment, and Arthur held the baby in the new room at the back of the house and said he thought that was the most flattering thing she had ever said to him. The winter of 1888 was a hard winter by Kansas standards, cold that came early and stayed, snow that drifted against the house and blocked the roads. Arthur and James Crow spent long cold days keeping the horses housed and the cattle fed, and Beatrice kept the house warm and fed and functional with the same methodical competence with which she did everything. And Margaret Conley, who was by now 60 years old and had been through more difficult winters than this, was invaluable in the daily work of caring for a new baby and 2 other children in a house cut off from town by weather. They were snowbound for 9 days at the worst of it, just the household and the animals and the prairie white to every horizon. And it was not comfortable, but it was not frightening either, because the house was solid, and the provisions were adequate, and the people in it were good company. In the evenings, Arthur read aloud from the books that were accumulating on the shelf he had built. They had more books than he had expected, because Beatrice bought them whenever she found them, and they had accumulated a real collection. And Thomas sat by the lamp with his own book, and Margaret knitted and Rose drew pictures on whatever paper was available. And the fire was good, and the baby slept. And it was one of the most complete evenings Beatrice could remember. She said so afterward, after the children were in bed and her mother had retired, and she and Arthur sat alone by the fire in the comfortable way of people who do not need to fill the silence. 9 days snowbound, she said. And that was one of the nicest evenings I can recall. That is how it should be, he said, when you are in the right place. She looked at him in the firelight. He was 39 years old now, a man who had come fully into himself in the way that the best men do in middle age, the roughness of youth smoothed into something more certain and more kind. The dark eyes were the same. The hands were the same. Everything that was essential in him was unchanged, and everything that had been rough or incomplete had resolved. Arthur, she said. Yes. I want you to know something, she said, with a care for words that was characteristic of her, the careful choosing of the right ones. I came to Caldwell in 1879 with the wrong name and $7 and a borrowed story, and I was more frightened than I have ever been in my life. And everything that I have now, the house and the children and the land and my mother and this evening by this fire, everything comes from the fact that I dropped those packages in the mercantile doorway and you picked them up. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then he said, I have thought about that too. I was not looking for anything when I came in through that door. I was going for flour and coffee. And you came out with more than that, she said. Considerably more, he said, with that slight curve at the corner of his mouth. She reached over and took his hand, the rough, warm hand that had helped her up onto a wagon seat one May morning in 1879, and he held it, and they sat in the firelight while the wind came over the prairie and the house held them. The years after the hard winter were good years. The horse operation continued to grow in the way of something that is well-founded and well-tended, not spectacularly, not with the drama of sudden fortune, but steadily and solidly, the way honest work produces honest results. By 1890, the Atkins spread was known across 3 counties as a source of good working horses, animals with sound legs and good temperaments, and Arthur had developed relationships with ranchers as far away as the Texas Panhandle who came to him when they needed to restock. Daniel Porter had by this time become an essential part of the operation, and in 1889 he had married a young woman named Sarah from Caldwell, and Arthur had helped him build a small house on the eastern edge of the Atkins property, where he could live with his wife and still be close to the work. This arrangement suited everyone. Daniel and Sarah had their own home and their own beginning, and Arthur had a capable and trusted man at hand. James Crow continued to work for the Atkins ranch through these years and beyond, and his own situation had improved in the specific way that the situation of a genuinely skilled person improves when they work for people who recognize skill and reward it fairly. Thomas Atkins grew into his father's steadiness and became by the time he was 12 a genuine help on the ranch, not in the way of child labor, but in the way of a boy who wants to learn and is learning, who trails his father through the horse corrals asking questions that are getting better every year, who rides out to check the fences on a Saturday with a competence that makes the older hands nod approvingly. He was going to be a horseman. You could see it in the way he moved around the animals, the unconscious ease of it. Rose was a different story and a better one in some respects, because she surprised everyone constantly. She had shown early signs of being interested in drawing, and this interest had turned into something serious and consuming. She drew the horses in minute and accurate detail. She drew the prairie and the sky and the people of Caldwell. She drew her grandmother Margaret with a capturing of character that made Margaret laugh, and then look at the drawing for a long time afterward. There was a school of thought in 1890 that said this was a fine thing for a girl, and a school of thought that said it was impractical, and Beatrice's response to the second school was characteristically blunt. She said that impractical was a word used by people who wanted other people to be smaller than they were, and that Rose would draw for as long as she wanted to draw. William was quieter than both of his siblings and more inward, and he had the habit of sitting in the kitchen with the books from the shelf and reading, with the focused absorption of someone for whom reading is not a pastime but a necessity. He wanted to know how things worked, not just horses and fences but everything, the way the weather moved, the way plants grew, the way people organized themselves into towns and governments. Beatrice found in him a recognizable quality, the hunger for understanding that she had felt all her life and that had been answered inadequately until she came west. In the summer of 1892, Beatrice's mother Margaret fell ill with a fever that came on quickly and resolved slowly, and for 3 weeks the house was organized around her care in the back room. The doctor, who by now was a different man named Patterson who had come to Caldwell after Calvert retired, said she was strong and that the illness would pass, and he was correct. But the illness left its mark in the way that illnesses leave marks on older bodies, and afterward Margaret was slower and quieter and more willing to sit in the chair by the window than she had been before. She recovered enough to be herself again, mostly, but it was a reminder of time, and Beatrice held it close and private and took the reminder seriously in the way of a person who is paying attention. She made sure to have the conversations with her mother that mattered, not to leave the things unsaid. She told her mother what she had told Arthur by the fire, that everything good had begun with a decision, a desperate and brave one in 1879, and that her mother was part of everything good, that her coming west in 1881 had been one of the best things. Margaret said, "You did not need me. You had already made it." "I needed you anyway," Beatrice said. "I always needed you." Margaret said nothing more about it, but she held Beatrice's hand for a moment in the particular way of a woman who has all her words and is choosing not to use them, because the hand is enough. By 1895, the Atkins Ranch was a genuine institution in the county, not grand but durable and respected, the kind of operation that other operations mention when discussing how to do things properly. Arthur was 45 years old and had the authority of a man who has built something real, and he wore it the way he wore his hat, without display, without self-consciousness, as a simple aspect of who he was. Beatrice was 40, and she had become one of the most capable and quietly influential women in the Caldwell area, not because she sought influence, but because sensible people recognized good judgment when they encountered it and kept asking for it. Thomas was 14, Rose was 12, William was 7, and the household was full of the particular noise and energy and occasional conflict of a house with 3 children at different stages of becoming. Beatrice and Arthur navigated parenthood with the same quality of partnership they brought to everything, not without disagreement, but never in opposition, always with the shared purpose of people who want the same thing and trust each other to want it. The decade that closed out the century was one of further change in Kansas. The frontier era was formally over. Frederick Jackson Turner had said so in 1893, and the cattlemen had felt it long before the historians named it. Caldwell was a quieter town than it had been in 1879. The wild days of the trail drives a memory that the older residents kept like photographs, worn smooth from handling. It was a real town now, with schools and churches and businesses and families, and the Atkins property was part of the fabric of it, woven in with 15 years of honest dealing and good work, and the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life lived in one place with intention. On a September evening in 1895, Arthur and Beatrice sat on the porch of the house on the rise, the house that he had built, and that they had extended twice, and that had become in the full sense of the word their home. The light was the autumn light, the gold that came every year and that she never entirely got used to, the light that had been shining when he said he loved her in the cottonwood stand, the light that had been present at every important moment of their life on this piece of land. Thomas was in the corral working with a young colt. Rose was on the porch steps with her drawing things, capturing the light in pencil with fierce concentration. William had been put to bed and was almost certainly reading by the lamp in his room rather than sleeping. Margaret was in the kitchen, and the sound of it was the sound of movement and comfort, the sound of being taken care of. "Beatrice," Arthur said. "Yes. Are you content?" It was the same question Mrs. Graves had applied to herself, content the highest praise. She turned the word over in her mind and measured her actual experience against it, the fair and honest accounting that she always brought to things, and she found that the word was not quite sufficient, but that it was the closest word in the available vocabulary. "More than content," she said, "considerably more." He smiled, that rare wide smile, the private one. "Considerably," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his, and they watched Thomas work the colt in the evening light and Rose draw the light on the paper, and the prairie spread out to the west in its enormous autumn gold, and the wind came through the way it had come through that first morning, the morning she stepped off the stage in her borrowed name, and smelled like possibility, except now it smelled like something better. It smelled like home. In the years that followed, and there were many good years, Thomas did become the horseman that his childhood had promised he would be, and by the time he was 20, he was working alongside his father with the authority of a genuine partner, understanding the horses and the land with a depth that made Arthur proud in ways he could not always articulate, and so expressed instead in the quality of his attention, and the trusting of larger and larger decisions to his eldest son. Rose's drawing became painting, and she went for a year to study in Kansas City when she was 18, which caused the two schools of thought to re-air their positions, and Beatrice remained firm on the side of Rose going, and Rose went, And she came back to the Atkins ranch with a portfolio and a perspective and a quiet certainty about what she was and what she could do. And she established herself as an artist of the prairie and its people that in time would come to be recognized well beyond Caldwell, Kansas. William, the reading boy, the observing boy, went to study at a college in Lawrence when he was 17, which required the family to think carefully about money and to determine that they had enough. And he studied the law and the natural sciences with the voracious attention he had brought to the books on the kitchen shelf. And he wrote letters home of such articulate affection and observation that Beatrice kept them all, tied with cord in the trunk at the foot of the bedroom. Margaret Conley lived to 71 years old, a full and rich old age by the standards of the century, and she died in the winter of 1900 in the back room of the Atkins house with Beatrice holding her hand and Arthur in the doorway, and the house around her that she had come to and stayed in because it was, as she had recognized immediately, a house where things were right. She was buried in the Caldwell Cemetery on a clear February day, and both Mrs. Graves and James Crow attended the service, and afterward the family came back to the house and ate, and talked about Margaret with the honesty and warmth that she would have required. And Thomas made a speech that surprised everyone with its precision and its love, and Rose cried and did not try to hide it, and William sat very still and was very young looking in the way that death makes the young look young. Beatrice grieved her mother with the thoroughness of a woman who was not afraid of grief, who understood it as the appropriate response to love. And Arthur was present with her in that grief the way he was present in everything, not fixing it, not making it smaller, but sitting alongside it and letting it be what it was, and that was enough, which is to say it was everything. Mrs. Graves lived to 78 and died in 1903, and by that time she was a beloved figure in Caldwell, the sharp-eyed woman who had run the best boarding house in town and who had opinions about everything and was not unkind about most of it, and who had been Beatrice Atkins's first friend in Kansas. Beatrice stood at her graveside and thought about the kitchen where she had sat that first night and told the truth, and the way Mrs. Graves had said that coming here with nothing and choosing to stay had been brave, and she thought that this was true of Mrs. Graves herself, this woman who had built her whole life with her own deliberate hands. In the first years of the new century, Arthur and Beatrice were in their 50s, and the ranch had settled into the rhythm of a mature operation, the excitement of the building years behind it, and in front of it only the continuation of the good thing, which is not a lesser thing but a different thing, the thing you arrive at when you have built well. They walked the land together on Sunday mornings the way they had always walked it, checking the fences and the horses and the creek, and they talked the way they had always talked, which was to say constantly and with interest, because they had not run out of things and they showed no sign of running out. One Sunday morning in the fall of 1905, they walked down to the cottonwood stand by the creek where he had first told her he loved her 26 years earlier. The trees were enormous now, the cottonwoods that had been young trees in 1879 grown full and heavy with age, their leaves going gold in the October light. They stood among the trees and the light came through in pieces, dappled and warm, and the creek ran over its stones the way it always had. Arthur took her hand in both of his. 26 years on this land, he said. 26 years, she said. You picked up the packages in the doorway, he said, which was his version of the story. She had picked them up and they had handed things back and forth and she had told him her name was the wrong one, and then months later she had told him her right name, and then she had taken his. You came through the door without looking, she said, which was her version. Also true, he said. She looked at him in the cottonwood light, this man she had built a life with, and the love she felt was not the acute, bright thing of the early years. It was deeper and calmer and more total, the way a river becomes when it has run a long way and found its full depth. She had loved him completely, and she loved him completely still, and the completeness of it had only grown richer with the years. He leaned down and kissed her with the tenderness of a man who has kissed the same woman for 26 years and finds it newly true each time. And the cottonwood leaves fell around them in the October light. And the creek ran on. And the house stood on the rise above them with smoke from the kitchen chimney going straight up into the clear fall sky, because the air was still, and everything was still, and everything was right. She had arrived in Caldwell wearing the wrong name, a name that pinched and gaped and told lies about her, and she had left the old life and built a new one. And the name she wore now was his Atkins, Beatrice Atkins, and it fit her in the way a name fits when you have lived a full life inside it. When you have worn it through childbirth and grief and harvest and hard winters and good summers and 26 years of love on a piece of Kansas prairie that smelled. When the wind came from the right direction. Exactly like possibility. She wore it like a woman who knows she is exactly where she is supposed to be. Which is to say, she wore it like a woman who has come home.